Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Glass of Blessings, a novel by Barbara Pym, narrated by Mary Sarah. When God at first made man, having a glass of blessings standing by, let us, said he, pour on him all we can. Let the world's riches, which dispersed lie, contract into a span. George Herbert, The Pulley. Chapter 1. I suppose it must have been the shock of hearing the telephone ring, apparently in the church, that made me turn my head and see Piers Longridge in one of the side aisles behind me. It sounded shrill and particularly urgent against the music of the organ, and it was probably because I had never before heard a telephone ringing in church that my thoughts were immediately distracted, so that I found myself wondering where it could be and whether anyone would answer it. I imagined the little bent woman in the peacock blue hat who acted as verger going into the vestry and picking up the receiver gingerly, if only to put an end to the loud, unsuitable ringing. She might say that Father Thames was engaged at the moment or not available. But surely the caller ought to have known that, for it was St. Luke's Day, the patronal festival of the church, and this lunchtime mass was one of the services held for people who worked in the offices nearby, or perhaps for the idle ones, like myself, who had been too lazy to get up for an earlier service. The ringing soon stopped, but I was still wondering who the caller could have been, and finally decided on one of Father Thames's wealthy elderly female friends, inviting him to luncheon or dinner. Then a different bell began to ring, and I tried to collect my thoughts, ashamed that they should have wandered so far from the service. I closed my eyes and prayed for myself, on this my 33rd birthday, for my husband Rodney, my mother-in-law Sybil, and a vague collection of friends who always seemed to need praying for. At the last minute I remembered to pray for a new assistant priest to be sent to us, for Father Thames had urged us in the parish magazine to do this. When I opened my eyes again, I could not help looking quickly at the side aisle, where I had caught a glimpse of the man who looked like Piers Longridge, the brother of my great friend Rowena Talbot. She usually spoke of him as poor Piers, for there was something vaguely unsatisfactory about him. At 35, he had had too many jobs, and his early brilliance seemed to have come to nothing. It was also held against him that he had not yet married. I wondered what could have brought him to St. Luke's at lunchtime. I remembered Rowena telling me that he had recently obtained work as a proofreader to a firm of printers specializing in the production of learned books, but I had understood that it was somewhere in the city. I did not know him very well, and had seen very little of him recently. Probably he was one of those people who go into churches to look at the architecture and stay for a service out of curiosity. I stole another quick look at him. In novels, or perhaps more often in parish magazine stories, one sometimes reads descriptions of a lonely figure kneeling at the back of the church, his head bowed in prayer. But Piers was gazing about him in an inquisitive, interested way. I realized again how good-looking he was, with his aquiline features and fair hair, and I wondered if I should have a chance to speak to him after the service was over. When this moment came, Father Thames, a tall, scraggy old man with thick white hair and a beaky nose, was standing by the door, talking in his rather too loud social voice to various individuals, calling out to a young man to keep in touch, while others slipped past him on the way back to their offices, perhaps calculating whether they would have time for a quick lunch or a cup of coffee before returning to work. Although I had quite often been to his church, which was near where I lived, Father Thames and I had not yet spoken to each other. Today, as I approached him, I had the feeling that he would say something, but rather to my surprise, for I had not prepared any opening sentence, I was the one to speak first, and what I said was really rather unsuitable. How strange to hear a telephone ringing in church. I don't think I ever have before, I began and then stopped, wondering how he would take it. He threw back his head, almost as if he were about to laugh. "Have you not?" he said. "Oh,
It is always ringing here, although we have another one at the clergy house, of course. Usually it's business, but just occasionally. Kind friend may be inviting me to luncheon or something of the sort. People are so kind.
So it could have been as I had imagined, but there were 2 priests at the clergy house. Were the invitations always for Father Thames, and never for mild dumpy little Father Bode, with his round spectacled face and slightly common voice, who always seemed to be the subdeacon at High Mass, and who had once read the wrong lesson at a carol service? I was sure that Father Bode was equally worthy of eating smoked salmon and grouse, or whatever luncheon the hostesses might care to provide. Then it occurred to me that he might well be the kind of person who would prefer tinned salmon, though I was ashamed of the unworthy thought, for I knew him to be a good man.
As a matter of fact, that telephone call was about Father Ransom, our new assistant priest, Father Thames continued. That much Mrs. Spooner was able to tell me after the service. In fact, from what I understood her to say, it may even have been Ransom himself on the telephone, but she was understandably a little flustered.
I wonder if it was a good omen that the new assistant priest should have telephoned in the middle of a service, or if it showed some lack of something. "I'm so glad to hear that you have found somebody," I said.
Yes, prayer has been answered in the way that it so often is. Of course, there are still difficulties to be overcome, but if all goes according to plan, he should be with us next month. Then we shall be able to get our full winter programme started. You must come and have a glass of sherry one evening. Or perhaps you would like to join one of the study groups, he added, seeming to offer me 2 strangely contrasting alternatives. We are hoping to go very thoroughly into the South India business this autumn.
His voice trailed off, and I could see that his glance had left me and fixed itself on a young man who was trying to slip past him.
"Now, Geoffrey," he called out, "how would you like to be a server?"
Geoffrey looked sheepish and mumbled something to the effect that he would not like it very much. He managed to make his escape while Father Thames was being buttonholed by an elderly woman of the type that always seems to waylay the clergy in porches and doorways.
"Wilmet,"
said a voice at my side.
"Don't you remember me?"
It was Piers Longridge. We walked out into the October sunshine together.
"I noticed you in church," he said. "I was sure it was you."
"I noticed you," I said. And then I seemed to get caught up with Father Thames.
"Father Thames," he laughed. "Surely there's something rather odd about the name?"
"Yes, I suppose there is, but I'm used to it now. And he does seem to have lived it down. The oddness, I mean. Do you often come here?"
"No. This is the first time. Perhaps Rowena told you. I've got a job in London now as a proofreader for French and Portuguese books, and I'm also teaching those languages at evening classes to earnest clerks and middle-aged ladies. Terribly like an early novel by H.G. Wells, don't you think?"
"It seems respectable work," I ventured.
"Yes, it keeps me going." "Are you a regular worshipper at St. Luke's, as they say?"
"Yes, I've been coming here for a few months. You see, the church nearest to us is very low, and I couldn't bear that."
"I should imagine not,"
said Piers. We walked on a little way. "And what's your news? You're not married yet?" I asked rather brightly.
"Good heavens, no. What should I marry on? And women are so terrifying these days, and seem to expect so much. Really far more than one could possibly give. Not that I would include you in my condemnation," he added quickly. "You look particularly charming today, Wilmet."
He smiled down at me in the provocative way I remembered. I was pleased at his compliment, for I always take trouble with my clothes, and being tall and dark, I usually manage to achieve some kind of distinction. Today I was in pale coffee brown with touches of black and coral jewellery. Rodney seldom commented on my appearance now, and Piers had that engaging air of making me feel that he meant what he said. I was sorry when we came to a crossroads and he said he must leave me.
"Back to work," he sighed. "I expect we shall meet again. Perhaps for lunch one day,"
he added uncertainly, as if feeling that something was expected of him, but not liking to commit himself. "You must come and see us," I said.
"I'm afraid I'm not a very sociable person in the conventional way.
he said quickly.
"But I'm sure we shall meet."
"Yes," I said. "Goodbye." I decided to wait for a bus to take me to the shops, and when the right one came I went on the top and sat looking down into the street. We had not gone very far before I saw Piers about to enter what could not by any stretch of the imagination have been his place of work, for it was a pub, or rather a wine lodge, one of those attractively named places of refreshment, which seemed to have an almost poetic air about them, like the Portuguese quintas, and indeed the comparison was not inappropriate, for Piers and his sister had been brought up in Portugal, where their father had been in the wine trade. I began to look back over what I could remember of Piers's career. He had been at Oxford, or Cambridge, but had got a disappointingly low class in his final examinations. He had taught in a school, been a courier with a travel agency, worked for a time in the BBC, and helped in the compilation of a Portuguese dictionary. It was from the title page of this work that I had gleaned some further information, for he was described as Piers Longridge, B.A., late of the British Museum, sometime lecturer in English literature, at a college in Portugal, whose name I could not remember, and now creeping into a wine lodge at 2 o'clock in the afternoon when he had told me that he was going back to work. How the glory had departed, if glory it had ever been. The words late and sometime seemed all of a sudden rather sad, and Piers himself, glimpsed from the bus, a rather shambling figure, more worn and less glamorous than he had seemed in the kindlier light of the church. I noticed that he did not go in immediately to have his drink, but lurked outside on the pavement, gazing into the road, and then at a line of parked cars in what seemed a very odd way. Then I remembered Rowena telling me about his obsession with car numbers, which he either collected in simple numerical order or used in more complicated games, such as spotting a car with his own initials and adding up the numbers that followed it to see if they were propitious. It seemed a foolish game for a grown man to play, and I felt mean to have caught him at his folly, to be spying on him, as it were. I was glad when the bus moved on, and I saw him at last enter the wine lodge. Later, when I had finished my wandering round the shops and was approaching home, it occurred to me how very bleak and respectable the house looked. This appearance was of course very fitting for Rodney, a civil servant, but it hardly seemed to suit Sybil, my mother-in-law, who is what one calls a real character, though not in a tiresome way. As I opened the front door, she was standing in the hall, a dumpy, square-faced woman of 69, energetic and brusque in her manner. She had been in youth, and still was, passionately interested in archaeology, and the big table in the basement kitchen was often covered with pie dishes full of pottery fragments, waiting to be labelled and classified. Now she was trying to arrange some flowers, grimly and without enjoyment, tweaking them here and there, with impatient gestures. "Ah, Wilmet, just at the right moment," she said. "I don't seem able to get these right at all. I was trying to make a natural arrangement, but there seems to be something evil and malicious about chrysanthemums." "Let me try." I took off my gloves and set to work. I have a talent for arranging flowers, and soon had them looking most artistically natural. "Noddy telephoned to say that he's bringing a friend home for dinner," Sybil went on. "From the ministry?" "Yes, I suppose so. All Noddy's friends seem to be from the ministry, don't they?" Sybil seemed to take a sardonic pleasure in calling her son by their childish nickname, which now seemed so unsuitable for a civil servant, approaching middle age. I sometimes wondered if that was why she did it. "I'd better go and change, then." "Don't make yourself too grand, dear. I was just going to say that civil servants don't notice what their wives wear, or the wives of their colleagues. One of those foolish generalizations that couldn't possibly be true." "I suppose a female colleague would notice more?" Sybil laughed. "Those splendid and formidable women. I often think that was one of the reasons why Noddy didn't want you to have a job, for fear you might turn into the kind of woman one sees getting out of the train at St. James's Park or Westminster, carrying a briefcase with E.R. stamped on it." "I suppose some of them try to combine marriage with a career? I mean the ones who carry baskets as well as briefcases, and look both formidable and worried, as if they hope to slip into the butcher's before going to their desks." "Yes, Those single women also have to eat, or maybe entertaining friends to dinner, said Sybil. I read in the paper the other day of a woman civil servant who was discovered preparing Brussels sprouts behind a filing cabinet. Poor thing, I suppose she felt it would save a precious 10 minutes when she got home. Yes, I laughed, and one could top and tail gooseberries or shell peas quite easily in an office, perhaps even without the shelter of a filing cabinet. Good heavens, there's Rodney's key in the lock. I must hurry. When I came down again, the men were in the drawing room drinking sherry. Sybil, who had evidently not considered them worthy of a change of dress, was with them. But then her clothes always looked the same, of no particular style or even colour, though quite neat, except when she dropped cigarette ash on them. A stiff-looking young middle-aged man was standing by the fire. He had something of Rodney's air about him, except that Rodney was better-looking and going bald in a rather distinguished way, which seemed suitable to his age and position in the ministry, whereas this man had a thick crop of wiry greying hair.
Wilmet, I don't think you've met James Karsh, have you?
Rodney said. We nodded and bowed to each other, and Rodney went over to the table by the window to get me a drink. I think I'll have a dry martini, I said. It doesn't seem quite the weather for sherry. Too mild or something? St. Luke's little summer. A shadow, surely of displeasure, seemed to cross James Karsh's face, and I guessed that he was probably one of those men who disapprove of women drinking spirits, or indeed of anyone drinking gin before a meal. Gin always gives me a dry mouth, said Sybil in her detached way. Even the smallest amount. I wonder why that is.
You're sure you wouldn't prefer gin and lime, dear?
Said Rodney, hesitating with his hand on the Noyer Prat bottle. No, I'd rather have French, please. Let her have what she likes, Noddy, said Sybil. After all, it is her birthday.
Of course. And that reminds me, I saw Griffin at lunchtime and arranged about your present.
Thank you, darling. Mr. Griffin was Rodney's bank manager. I imagined the scene, dry and businesslike, the transfer of a substantial sum of money to my account. Nothing really spontaneous or romantic about it. Still, perhaps something good and solid like money was better than the extravagant bottle of French scent that some husbands, my friend Rowena's, for example, might have given. And the whole thing was somehow characteristic of Rodney, and those peculiarly English qualities which had seemed so lovable when we had first met in Italy during the war, and I had been homesick for damp green English churchyards and intellectual walks and talks in the park on a Saturday afternoon.
Such a pity Hilary can't be with us this evening,
said Rodney rather formally to James Karsh. Is she ill? I didn't quite gather, said Sybil bluntly.
Well, not really. She has just had a child,
said James in a rather surprised tone. How nice, I said, trying to sound warm and feminine. Boy or girl?
A boy.
That is supposed to be the best, laughed Sybil. We drained our glasses and went into the dining room. I was touched to see that Sybil had chosen all my favourite dishes, smoked salmon, roast duckling, and gooseberry pie with cream. The men would not, of course, have realised that they had been chosen specially for me, looking upon the whole meal as no more than was due to them.
One never quite knows what wine to drink with gooseberries,
said Rodney, turning to James Karsh rather apologetically.
I suppose something a little drier than might be considered usual with the sweet. Is that about the best one can do?
I let out a snort of laughter before I realised that Rodney's manner was serious, almost deferential, and that the question was being gravely considered. So James was one of those boring wine men, I thought.
I think you've hit upon an admirable compromise here, he said politely, though I believe you could almost get away with one of those outrageously sweet wines. Perhaps even Samos, the kind of thing that seems otherwise to have no possible raison d'être. Perhaps that is their raison d'être, to be drunk with gooseberries or rhubarb. If you like, I will raise the matter with my own wine merchant, a man of considerable courage, even panache. Thank you, said Rodney seriously. We, my wife and mother, rather, are very fond of gooseberries. We often eat them in one form or another.
Perhaps they are more a woman's fruit, said Sybil, like rhubarb. Women are prepared to take trouble with sour and difficult things, whereas men would hardly think it worthwhile. The men were silent for a moment, as if pondering how they might defend themselves, or whether that too was hardly worthwhile. Rodney's next remark showed that they'd evidently considered it not to be.
"And what have you done today, Wilmet?" he asked. "I hope you've enjoyed your birthday. We have planned a theatre party for tomorrow evening," he added, turning to James, as if he felt some explanation was necessary.
"I went to the lunchtime service at St. Luke's," I said, "and Father Thames actually spoke to me. Then I went shopping."
"Our parish church isn't really high enough for Wilmet's taste," Rodney explained. "I'm afraid it's all the same to me," said James. "I don't go to any kind of church."
"Neither do I," said Sybil. "I thought out my position when I was 20, and I've found no reason since to change or modify the conclusions I came to then." I could not protest, but there was something about my mother-in-law's bleakly courageous agnosticism that I admired. It seemed to me rather brave for somebody nearing the end of life to hold such views. I wondered if she was ever afraid when she woke up in the small hours of the night and thought of death. "Today, during the service," I said, "the telephone rang in the vestry, and that apparently was the answer to our prayers. We had been praying for a suitable assistant priest," I explained.
"Yes, I suppose that is quite often done," said James in a detached tone. "But I imagine that certain practical measures must be taken as well. A word to the bishop or the patron of the living, perhaps even an advertisement in a suitable paper."
"Ah, yes, the Church Times," said Sybil, "with a few tempting tidbits to encourage suitable applicants. Vestments, Western use, large robe choir, opportunities for youth work, though perhaps not the last. We know the kind of thing that sometimes happens. The lurid headlines in the gutter press, or the small side paragraph in the better papers." Rodney threw her a warning glance. "How very distressing it all is," Sybil went on, ignoring her son. "One wonders how these poor creatures fare afterwards. I suppose they would be unfrocked. Is that the procedure? One hopes there is some place where they can be received afterwards. It would be a noble work, that. The rehabilitation of some of those fallen ones. Even a house of this moderate size could accommodate 4 or 5? Rodney and I looked at her apprehensively, for Sybil was a keen social worker.
"Surely, Mother, you aren't thinking of starting such a place here?" asked Rodney impatiently. "And we do seem to have got rather off the point, don't we?" "Perhaps we have strayed into a byway," said James with a little laugh. "I suppose the arrival of a new clergyman must be rather exciting for the ladies. Would he be a celibate?"
"I should think so," I said. "Neither Father Thames nor Father Bode is married."
"Do they live together at the vicarage?"
"Well, it is called the Clergy House," I explained. "It is a rather Gothic-looking building in the same style as the church. On the door is a notice telling you not to ring unless on urgent business."
"I should have thought all clergy business must be urgent," said Rodney. "They are concerned with the fundamental things, after all. Birth, marriage, death, sin. Though I suppose they are also besieged by idle women wanting to know about jumble and things like that."
"Well, let us hope this new one will be up to standard," said Sybil vaguely, with a glance at me. "Shall we leave the gentlemen to their port and manly conversation? Women are supposed not to like port, except in a rather vulgar way," she added as we rose from the table. "And the male conversation that goes with it is thought to be unsuitable for feminine ears." I could not help smiling as I looked at the two men, who seemed so very formal and correct. I suppose they might discuss the port itself, then perhaps something that had happened at the ministry. Trouble with the typing pool, or the iniquities of some colleague would be the very worst that might be expected of them. "I saw Rowie and his brother today," I said to Sybil when we were alone in the drawing-room. "He was at St. Luke's, and we had a few words of conversation. Then I got on to a bus and saw him going into a pub." "Oh, dear!" Sybil paused and then laughed. I wonder why I said that. Isn't there supposed to be something unsatisfactory about him? He must be well on into his 30s now. At what age does one start to accept a person as he is? Could a man in his 50s or 60s still go on being labelled as unsatisfactory? Perhaps up to 30, one may still go on expecting great things of people, I suggested, or even 35. Why is Piers unsatisfactory? Because he has had rather a lot of jobs and hasn't yet married? Is that it? Yes, I think so. You see, Rowena is so very much married, with 3 children, and Harry being in Mincing Lane, I giggled. You know what I mean. So very solid and good, and so very much sticking to the business founded by his great-great-grandfather. I suppose Rowena chose him as a kind of contrast to all the Portuguese men she must have met living out there. Somehow, one doesn't think of them as being solid and reliable. Piers is now proofreading learned books and teaching French and Portuguese in the evenings, he told me. Oh! Let's go to some of his classes, said Sybil enthusiastically. I really had thought we might go to Portugal next summer, and it would be a good thing to get some rudiments of the language. Will you ask him about them next time you see him? Yes, but I'm not sure when that will be. I don't suppose he'll be at Rowena's when I go to stay there. Harry doesn't really like him. What a pity. Why don't you ask him here one evening? He might like to come into a good, solid English home. I suppose ours is that. Home life is generally supposed to be a good influence, isn't it? Yes, but perhaps only for young men and women coming to London for their first job from the provinces, for the times when they aren't spending an evening at the YMCA or some church youth club. I suppose Piers wouldn't really come into that category. Incidentally, Father Thames said something about evening study groups in the winter. Perhaps he might be persuaded to go to those. That hardly seems likely, said Sybil with a laugh. But it would be nice for you to have some intellectual occupation, if it would be that. You mean that I should have some work to do? I asked, rather on the defensive, for I sometimes felt guilty about my long idle days. I did not really regret not having children, but I sometimes envied the comfortable busyness of my friends who had. Nobody expected them to have any other kind of occupation. Not at all, dear, said Sybil calmly. Everybody should do as they like. You seem to fill your days quite happily. It was true that I had tried 1 or 2 part-time jobs since my marriage, but Rodney had the old-fashioned idea that wives should not work unless it was financially necessary. Moreover, I was not trained for any career and hated to be tied down to a routine. My autumn plans to take more part in the life of St. Luke's, to try to befriend Piers Longridge, and perhaps even go to his classes, or to keep me fully occupied, I thought. Why don't you come to the settlement with me one day? Sybil suggested. Mary Beamish was asking me if you'd be interested the last time I was there. Yes, I'll come along with you, I said. It might be rather. I'd been going to say amusing, but obviously the word was unsuitable. My sentence was left unfinished as the men came back into the room. Ah, the gentleman, said Sybil with a slightly mocking air. Now we shall have to stop our conversation, and you will have to stop yours. We were exchanging our experiences of the young women who do our typing, said James. Oh, there was nothing shocking about them, he added, sensing Sybil's ironical glance. I was telling James how I had occasion to criticise, quite mildly I may say, a piece of work one of them had done, said Rodney. I had asked for a 3-inch margin, and she had done only a 2-inch. It was really quite important, or I shouldn't have asked for it. I said, I'm afraid this won't do, Miss Pym. Whereupon she snatched the report out of my hand and ran from the room in tears, slamming the door after her. It was really quite upsetting. Perhaps she's in love with you, I heard myself saying with unsuitable detachment. There was a slight pause. Then James burst into laughter and said, Oh, I can assure you, nothing like that goes on in our department. I was glad that he had broken the silence. I glanced at Rodney, but he did not seem to have noticed anything, if indeed there had been anything to notice. You like this Tia Maria, don't you, Mother? He said, smoothly taking up a bottle. I know Wilmet finds it too sweet. I took a large gulp of brandy.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?